Hello, today I'm joined by James Gordanifar to talk about student recruitment and the challenges of doing that globally. James, welcome.
Thank you.
To kick us off, could you just give us a potted history of your career to date, a bit of your background?
Are you sure you want to ask that question? I actually started my career as an actor, and after a couple of years of doing bits and bobs, decided I wanted a proper job. And I'd always funded my kind of studies in acting through working in hospitality. So it seemed like a safe bet to do a management program with the restaurant that I worked for, big branded chain of restaurants. So I ended up working, managing a restaurant. And I met my now wife at the time, and the whole 9 to 5 thing needed to be a focus for me to have kids and all the rest of it. So at that point I fell into recruitment, and I didn't really know what it was, and I started out as a recruitment consultant, recruiting IT professionals, and over time kind of climbed my way up the ranks and moved closer to more of an internal in-house role. And I sort of again fell into student recruitment, but with a really big employer. Fast forward 10 years, I've done a number of roles within early careers in different organizations in different capacities. And now I'm a global head of talent acquisition for all of early careers talent at WTW.
Excellent, thank you. And one question that I think would be really interesting to understand the answer to is, I know you've done a lot of UK focused roles, you're now in a global role. What's the biggest difference in global recruitment as compared to UK based recruitment? Yeah,
I mean, you could talk about kind of cultural differences, but I actually think the biggest difference is the kind of the market norms and the market drivers. So in the UK, you really kind of, it's a really sophisticated early careers market. You know, we take for granted that we have CV blind processes. Many organizations have removed academics. We place emphasis on skills, and we have assessments and technology driven processes, assessment centers. It's taken for granted, because when you go across the pond to North America, it's actually a lot more traditional than you'd expect. And there's a real resistance to things like, the GPA is everything, right? That's going to determine whether someone's successful. So the kind of, as you come from the UK, where it's kind of, hang on a minute, we know that not to be true, and it's all about potential. There's a natural rub there, for example. So that's one of the things I've definitely encountered in that market. And then the processes themselves are less tech enabled. They're more CV focused. Working with assessments is not really the norm in early careers over there. We've done it, but it's been challenging. And then if you think about in Asia, for example, India, again, massive focus on hierarchy. In fact, there are certain, and this was amazing to me, there are certain tiering within the individual universities. So for example, we couldn't go and present at a certain university unless we met their criteria as a tiered employer. So they have tier 1, tier 2, whatever it might be. And that determines what kind of qualifications you get, or what salary you're going to give, whether you meet their tiering. So you can't go and present at any university. You've got to be tiered by the university. So totally different market pressures as you work in a global.
A whole new world.
Yeah, completely.
Literally.
Yeah.
And I mean, really interesting to hear some of your experience of working in the States there, and it being maybe a little bit more traditional. I mean, what's the impact on DE&I, which I know will definitely be a topic we talk about today, but those more traditional approaches focused on CVs are getting a lot of attention at the moment in terms of impact of generative AI, problems with bias when reviewing CVs that aren't blind. What are those conversations like with your US colleagues?
In some respects, they're almost ground zero educational and kind of showing them what things could be based on what we've done in the UK. And that's why I say it's such a sophisticated market. I'm not saying it's perfect, but there are practices that could work in the context of the US. I mean, one of the things is about how you tier the universities that you actually go to in the first place. They have this whole term around HBCU, so former colleges essentially, that were kind of more from traditional times where certain demographics could only go to those universities, right? And they're still in existence, but kind of more mainstream now and part of the overall kind of community of university and so on. So actually there's a whole strategy around working with those particular universities and putting emphasis there. Equally as well, they have DE&I partnerships and events similar to the UK, but probably not as prominent. But the big thing over there is actually the digital outreach. There are apps and specific tools that mean you can target and direct source candidates. So again, you're kind of like, you're taking bits of what we do in the UK and applying it to a totally different context to drive a better outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just sort of panning out for a little bit, thinking about student recruitment generally, what would you say are the biggest challenges for student recruitment at the moment?
Yeah, there's a few I think that are quite prominent at the moment. I think one of the biggest ones, and I think more employers should talk about this, is the latent impact of the pandemic on young people. And I think there are elements of this that we're not going to see, like we're seeing it now, but we're probably not going to see for a number of years. You know, if I think about my own children at the time who were about 8 and 5, I think, and you know the kind of shock to the system that had on them, the lost learning. I saw in my son particularly, who was 5, a loss in confidence, right, for a sustained period of time. What's that impact right now? Now he's 10 or whatever it is, and what's that going to be in 16? You know, when he's 16, how can you catch up? Because those formative years are so important. We don't know what that's going to look like, and we're already seeing it in students coming through into the workplace, a sense of lost confidence, less ability to have work experiences, and kind of coming in. You know, I think a recent study, I think it was the ISE, it was around 50% of employers were saying that actually they do not feel graduates are work ready. So employers are having to work harder to build that confidence, build those capabilities. And I don't. This is just the start of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it will be felt for a long time. We did a really interesting piece of work, this is going back a number of years, but it was essentially asking the question, what parts of us and our personality are we either kind of born with, or perhaps they're developed in early childhood, our formative years, versus, what are the things that we pick up through our formal education, and what are the things that we pick up with work experience. And what we found was that the kind of strategic, kind of pioneering stuff that came with work experience. The skills around sort of organisation and analysis came with our formal education. People skills, that seemed you either had it or you didn't. So that's either innate or formed in early childhood. So I think that's a really good point. We could see an impact on people coming through, young people coming through in 15, 20 years' time. And we probably need a plan for that.
Yeah, and we're not even talking about, obviously, then the societal piece and things like social media, right? The impact that has on communication. Everybody's talking about that, but actually, what are we going to do about it? I was at an event earlier today, actually, and we were talking about recruiters, the role of a recruiter changing as Gen AI comes into the workplace. And someone was saying, well, they're going to do more high value add activity. We expect them to pick up the phone and talk to candidates. Well, guess what? Candidates probably under 30 don't want you to pick up the phone to them. And if you call them, they're probably not going to answer. So I'm not sure that's the answer, is it? It might be there are different strokes for different folks, and actually the skill is going to be personalisation.
Yes, absolutely. Personalisation, definitely something I want to come back to. Before we go there though, how do you think we can help build young people's confidence and get them more work ready? What are the things organisations can be doing?
I think they have to, first of all, accept that that is a thing. And you're not just going to get someone from day one that is, going to hit the ground running and be ultimately successful. You've got to play a part in that success. And work readiness will need to be invested in, both in terms of once they hit the ground and the support around them, and the considerations around things like working from home and whether they should be learning from others and observing certain things, but also the aspects of what can you do before they join, right? And actually, assessment's an interesting piece there because the process should really tell you what are the gaps. And here you go, hiring manager. This is where your individual might need some support. What can you be doing, before they join, let alone once they do join, right? And I think it goes before that. And I think where employers have not, over the past few years, have not done enough of this because we've taken it for granted that we've got digital tools and, kind of the game has changed in early careers and everybody's thinking about transformation and all these different ways of outreach, that we've forgotten some of the basics of the relationship with career services, the relationship with faculty, and the feedback loop from employers into education, maybe even schools with apprenticeships as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've had a conversation before, touching a little bit on that around that. I think there's a need for recruitment and talent development to work more closely together to harness all of that amazing data that you're getting at recruitment stage and using it not just for onboarding and early development, but the pre-boarding piece as well. I think there's real opportunity there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a fine balance though, right? Because if you imagine, being a student, graduate, you've kind of got your offer, you've got your finals to complete, and then your employer saying, come and learn this with us as well, right? So it is a fine balance. And I think there's probably ways of doing that in a more effective, impactful way. I mean, one thing that springs to mind, not that we're, I'm not saying we're doing this and we've got it right, but one of the biggest things in early careers right now is to create a sense of cohort because of longer term engagement and retention and a feeling of community. That can start before they join. And actually there's opportunities to bring them into your environment. If it's been mostly virtual as well, they're going to work there. We'll get them involved in the office. And as part of that day, let's do a session on what it means. What does day one look like? Well, how do you go from being a, kind of a graduate to a professional? What does that actually look like? Make it a bit more engaging. Absolutely. Throw in a free lunch as well.
Always helps. And I guess going back to personalisation, that plays a role, right? So rather than having a sheep dip approach where you go, here you go, everyone, here's all of the pre-boarding, come and do X, Y, Z, actually maybe giving individuals some choice over what they focus on and making it personalised, I think could have quite a big impact as well.
Yeah, I think so. And the role, that's where I think the role of ultimately the line manager, but also a buddy is really important. And that should really start before they join. It's difficult to say, oh, someone's been offered 6 months out, let's, you might not even know who the line manager is going to be at that point in early careers, but certainly a couple of months before they join, you'd expect that to be in place, right? So I think there's opportunities there. And speaking to personalisation, it might be actually that those conversations are geared around that and you equip them to have better conversations around how do you learn, what's going to work for you. Maybe they don't know, and that's part of your role to help them find out,
Yeah, absolutely. And do you see that sort of approach also helping with reneges? Because we're seeing that as an issue for a lot of big employers where graduates are accepting 4 or 5 offers and then waiting until a couple of months before to choose which one they're actually going to start with.
Yeah, and that's been a growing phenomenon for the time I've worked in early careers. It's just kind of snowballed with the pandemic, I think.
Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is, we're talking about personalisation. I think part of it is dehumanisation.
Interesting.
I think we've gone so virtual heavy that actually... So, for example, the reason why every employer I've ever worked for, and you ask the students, why did you choose us, like in a focus group or whatever, always consistently the main answer is because the people I met, the people I engaged with, the impression they gave me. It's not your EVP and your website and the pace of your all the stuff we care about and we're spending thousands of pounds on. Great. Just get them to connect with real people. That might help you. And I think we don't do enough of it. Our organisations as a whole are not doing enough of it because they're relying too much on virtual and tech and all the rest of it. And that might be driving some of that behaviour.
Absolutely. I saw in the paper a week or so ago that Deloitte is bringing back face-to-face interviews. I think this is possibly more to do with some kind of diligent stuff around being concerned that cheating isn't being picked up on.
Yeah.
But I guess there are other angles to that.
Yeah.
There could be other benefits. What's your view on that? Is that what we should be doing more of?
Well, there's definitely a growing sentiment in the market that we should, and there's a growing sentiment in my business that we should, and there's a growing desire from candidates that they want to meet and engage face to face, but in at the right point and and so on and so forth. My view is I think there is no substitute for meeting somebody face to face, and if you're going to make a decision about the rest of your life, well, I say the rest of your life, but certainly hopefully the first 10 years of your life by joining an organization, and if an organization is going to take a chance on an individual, surely you're going to want to do that in the most robust way. And I think a virtual recruitment process and all the wonderful technology that we have in place can do a lot of positive things for you. We probably have the Gen AI conversation at the moment, right? But I believe there is no substitute for meeting someone face to face and that kind of all the stuff you can't pick up on in a virtual setting, let alone the cheating side and all the rest of it, right? So I'm pro that, and I'm hopeful that more of that will come back into recruitment processes.
What are the barriers that need to be kind of knocked down in order for that to happen?
Well, I think one of them is obviously cost.
Companies
have saved a lot of money by going virtual when it comes to recruitment. There's also a time piece. There are certain corners of the student market that don't necessarily want to travel and have the kind of inconvenience, if you will, of doing that for an interview, which sounds crazy when you really want a job. But that is a sentiment that's out there as well, and something you need to demonstrate the benefit of.
Is there a diversity element to that as well? Maybe particularly from a social mobility perspective?
Possibly, but I don't know, why is that changed since 4 years ago or 5 years ago?
True.
When that was the norm and common practice.
No, that's true. Generative AI, we've touched on it, so let's go there. It has really very quickly brought up a number of new challenges for student recruitment processes. What are the things that worry you most?
I think that what worries me most is that assessments per se weren't necessarily built with generative AI in mind, or assessment processes even, right? So we're having to almost retrofit. And it's a bit square peg in a round hole, rather than saying, okay, let's solve for this problem right now. I think that there's the obvious piece around cheating, and there's a whole debate as to, is it cheating? Which I think is really confusing, because actually, if you're expecting someone to be their authentic self and give an authentic response, then yes, that's cheating, right? Surely. I don't know how you get around that and start to have a conversation about this or a debate. And I'm on that side, right? I think there are places we should design for aspects in the recruitment process where we embrace Gen AI, because they're going to use it in their role. But let's look at how they used it, how they got to the response they got to, how they prompted, how they thought, how they coded it, whatever. Great.
Exactly.
And let's ask that question. Right? Why shy away from that? We want them to embrace that, particularly younger generation need to bring that energy and that thought leadership in a way.
But you need to assess it in a standardized way that's fair.
Exactly. And there aren't really any robust solutions for that right now. It's just a conversation, So I think that's what concerns me really. And I think, I definitely, and that comes back to the face-to-face piece. I want to see someone's authentic self. And that's what worries me, is that actually, even not even in an asynchronous video interview, for example, in just a live video interview, you could 100% have a prompt up over here with ChatGPT. And if you're smart, you take the best bits and glance over and you just merge that into, your general answer that you'd have anyway. And no one's going to know the difference. So that's what worries me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something also about being able to, or kind of maybe it's more to do with interviewer skill. I think interview skills are going to become more and more critical in order to be able to really probe an answer and peel back the onion layers to make sure that you are getting that authentic self, rather than taking answer number one at face value and going, okay, yes, that ticks all of my scoring criteria, on to the next one. And I think actually what's happened over the years is that, and I don't think this is student recruitment specific, I actually think this is across the board, that focus on building assessor skills, good assessor skills, but good interview skills, has changed somewhat. And I think organisations are much more willing to cut corners on paying for decent training, for example.
Yes.
I think you also find that people go, I can interview, I'm very good at interviewing. And they don't think about all of the biases that they might have, and they don't recognise that actually to retain those skills, they kind of need to go back to the classroom on a regular basis and check in. And I think that's something that's going to become more and more important. To kind of test that authenticity piece.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, you touched on it there, but you know, the ED&I layer, as well as is this an authentic answer? I mean,
yes.
Let alone is the response relevant to the question set that I have.
Yeah.
Right? You've got so many facets now.
Yeah.
And I'm a recruiter by trade and, you know, by heart, I guess. And even I would find that difficult.
Yeah.
So we're then asking someone in the business, it's not their day job to do this, right? So there's that angle. So 100%. The other aspect as well is though, like screening teams who could be based in Manila.
Yeah.
You know, or I don't know, somewhere in Mumbai, for example. This is a real thing that organisations are leveraging to screen the responses of thousands of candidates.
Yeah.
You know, not only do you have all the layers I've just spoken about, but you've also got the language element as well.
Yes.
So these people need to be superhuman. Oh, and by the way, we want to try and pay them as little as possible so that we've got cost efficiency.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you solve that challenge?
Not right here, right now. I think that's
sure.
a big one. That is a really big one, absolutely. And do you see different challenges in different parts of the world, just going back to the kind of global versus kind of country-specific or region-specific role when it comes to generative AI?
I think it's really early to say.
Yeah.
You know, I don't observe any specific difference right now in terms of what the conversation we're having, because we're still forming our opinion really on it and how that's going to play out in different markets. There's probably a legislative side to this that different we already see that in New York, for example, with New York City law and so on. There's different levels of tolerance around this kind of whole AI topic. The other thing I think would probably be a cultural one. In certain cultures, you know, it is favourable to cheat.
Yeah.
That is a thing that's looked on positively to win an outcome.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with that or not is a different thing, right? But that's the thing in certain cultures. So that could play out as well.
Absolutely, indeed. And trying to build a global strategy and global consistency with all of that going on, it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
We touched on DE&I there. It's a topic that's been at the top of most organisations' agendas for a long time now. But I think we've seen shifts in different focus areas. So social mobility, neurodiversity, absolutely come to the fore.
Yeah.
What are the differences you see globally here in terms of that different focus?
Yeah, and it really does differ depending on the market that you're operating in. So as you say, UK and Ireland to a degree, social mobility, neurodiversity have become, you know, big focuses. Whereas if I think about North America and the kind of conversations we have in that market, it's more around gender and ethnicity, more so. And then in APAC, one of the things that's starting to come to the fore is around sexuality. It is more of a focus and a topic that people are starting to think about and be more concerned about. So it does vary depending on market.
And then how do you, so a similar question to the last, which we said very difficult was the answer. How do you bring that all together into a cohesive global strategy?
Yeah, it's obviously very difficult. I think one of the biggest things, and perhaps one of my bugbears when it comes to diversity and recruitment, is that for a number of years, you know, you've been asked for your diversity strategy or your social mobility strategy, And within diversity, you've obviously got all these different strands. We've only touched on 3 or 4 of them there, right? So, okay. And then you've got your kind of operational strategy over here. And it's kind of like, well, hang on a minute. Am I meant to have like 12 different strategies to, deliver this result? So one of my bugbears is actually, it should be one strategy. Diversity should be part of everything that you do. And every conversation. So when I'm designing an EVP and a new employer brand message, I'm not doing that just to deliver more volume or better quality. I'm also doing that thinking about diversity in mind. Or a new assessment process. I'm thinking about that with adverse impact in mind, right? And the other bugbear of mine, and where it comes to strategy as well, is actually, if you lead with diversity, I think you're pressing on the wrong focus. Diversity is the outcome. For me, the focus is inclusion. And actually, if you get inclusion and the whole equity piece right, that drives the right outcomes. So let's have that conversation within our processes, within our strategy. How is it inclusive? How do you adapt to a different type of audience in a different type of market? Because you've built for that level of flexibility. So I think those are the things that spring to mind for me.
Absolutely. And candidate experience, I quite like to touch on as well. I think another thing that's been at the top of student recruitment agendas for quite some time now. And because it's so paramount to student recruitment teams, I think often what happens is that the individuals in those teams are kind of looking for the next shiny new thing, as a way to woo candidates, to help them stand out from a very crowded market. I think in one way this is brilliant. It's really pushed the market on from a creativity perspective. However, I think it can very easily come at the expense of robustness. And so what are the things that you're thinking about and considering when you're looking at assessment as part of the student recruitment process?
Well, I think one of the first mantras is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that's a big theme at the minute within all parts of business, let alone recruitment, right? There are so many shiny toys out there. But actually, are you clear on your North Star as a business, as a TA function? What are you hanging your hat off? Because that is your guiding principle. Okay. So I think you got to start from that base, because then that gives you a set of criteria that actually you can evaluate different providers against and suppliers. I think that, again, before you even get to the shiny toy element or which provider you're going to work with as well, the biggest thing to understand is the robustness around their success or job analysis. For me, great assessment starts there. You don't get a great assessment without a really great job analysis or success analysis. The more time you spend understanding that, the governance around that, who you're going to engage, how robust it is, how much investment of time and what kind of data and richness you're going to get back, that's going to determine how successful your assessment is, in my mind. So really, that's one of the biggest things you should be evaluating a provider against. How often have they done that? What are their processes? What impact has that had, and what are the credentials then on the back of that with other organisations? And that's before you get to the efficacy of the tool that they have, right? Which is obviously super important, because what you're hiring for is quality. Does it give you the right output? Does it make business results and impact? Can you evidence that in terms of increased quality, better diversity, a better candidate experience, whatever it is? And that's when it comes back to your true north. So those are some of the things that really spring to mind before you get to how immersive is this experience for a candidate, because that is important. And what I'm a fan of, and I've done it in a couple of roles, but actually I'd really like to do more of this, is how do you tie the whole assessment part of the process to a narrative arc that goes through the whole recruitment process. So you've got that stickiness, that affinity, that connection with the brand, the authenticity of the people that you've seen in, oh my God, the person that's speaking to me in this video interview tutorial is the person that was on the website. And it's really thinking about the end-to-end journey. And I think that's where you can win in this space, and you can help reduce reneges, declines, all the rest of it.
And it's not just in that recruitment process, is it? That narrative arc and that thread. We then want that to continue into pre-boarding, onboarding, development, and then ultimately that you get better retention as well at the end of it.
So it's that commonality of not just, it's psychology really, isn't it? When you think about it, the language that you're using and the tone of voice. Like, and I really believe in this as well, that yes, the nuances with your EVP in the market and your employer brand to what your internal engagement and comms strategy is, but there should be unifying factors and principles behind that, because that journey starts from the minute you interact with the brand, and it doesn't look too dissimilar when I'm in the organization. Right. But then that comes back to the point that has to be an authentic shop window, and that's another bugbear of mine. That's happened massively since the pandemic. Organizations like spending tens if not hundreds of thousands on their employer brand, and it looks amazing, but is it really like that when you join? And I think that's very questionable.
And it ends up being you start and you go, oh, I'm not in the games room every day playing table football. I'm actually sat on my own in front of a spreadsheet for 12 hours.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And are there any nuances on that from a global perspective? So are different markets wanting different things in terms of their kind of North Star, or in terms of candidate experience, or...
I think from all facets of the recruitment process, there are nuances. Some of the obvious things that come to mind is imagery, language is obviously a really big thing as well. And, they care about different types of messaging, and there are different kind of motivators. But I suppose what I've learned is that through everything, you need to find the common threads, whether it's the language or the narrative, and then you adapt that according to what's important in that market or whatever. But there's a commonality to that messaging, right? But when I think about the kind of processes we have in place, this is where you can really trip up from an operational point of view. So if you're over customizing for every market, because the US wants to recruit in this way, and India want to recruit in this way, and the UK wants to do it this way, like you can quickly tie yourself up in knots, and then you can't achieve a global efficient process where actually you could have people supporting from a different location with a team over here in North America. It's never going to happen. There's too much nuance. So what you've got to find is what are I call them almost like gateways, or the kind of steps that are set in stone, and there's a handshake that everyone goes through this gate, but we intentionally build within that gate a level of customization for you, Mr. X, in this business, or the geography, or whatever it might be. But the gate doesn't change, because if the gate changes, or this fixed point in our process changes, we trip up, and the service is not as good for you, it's not as good for candidates, we don't end up delivering the best outcomes in terms of quality of hire, whatever it might be. And it's those consistent points that you have to find in your process that are non-negotiable, and you help stakeholders understand why, and the team understand why, and then you build for customization in those specific places.
And how have you best dealt with pushback on the need for a common thread for that gate to not change? Because I imagine you get it, you get pushback, you get people saying, but we're so different, we really need something unique. Where have you had the most success in challenging those beliefs?
It's been spending time with people, and it's been showing them through data. Largely it's rooted in data. In some of these things, like particularly around assessment, and you probably know this better than anybody, right? Sometimes you are asking people to take a leap of faith. And you can't get around that. And sometimes you have to say those words out loud, which is, you've got to trust me that I'm an expert at what I do, and I'll live and die by what happens next. And then you demonstrate the results. And it's having a really authentic conversation at times like that. And, in our case, when I think about some of the assessments we've used in the past as well, like involving the provider in actually showcasing their capability and inviting that community in to ask the difficult questions and see that, they do know what they're talking about, and there is structure behind this. But you can understand, like, recruitment, let alone early careers, is sensitive. And people, particularly early careers, everyone has an opinion because everyone went to school and university, 100%. Right? So you've got to let them into that dialogue and that conversation, and you've got to show them that it's not a dark art. And there's transparency that sits behind it, and you do know what you're doing in certain cases.
I think the irony is, I've always found it quite ironic anyway, that a lot of the time people believe that they are a better judge of character than the machine. Maybe it's human nature, right? It's we want to see the whites of people's eyes. We trust our own judgment. The fact that the data is very clear that humans are definitely not the best judge of other humans because of all of the biases that we have, that we're just steeped in, that no amount of unconscious bias training will get rid of. I think that does result in people going, I'm not sure if I trust the tests. I did one of those once and I didn't get the job. So therefore, surely there's a problem with it. And so that's such a common conversation that I have with clients on such a regular basis, or stakeholders rather than clients.
It definitely takes time.
It does.
And there's iteration behind it as well.
Yeah.
Like with anything, you don't get it right first time, I found. No matter how experienced it's not a silver bullet straight away, and there's constant review and insights and exploring the data. And as well, that's where you can win stakeholders over, is taking them on that journey. Exactly, so that they can input and you can reshape it. And that's why the success analysis or the job analysis is so important, because actually it is your vehicle to involve them and for them to have a voice, so that what you present back with the solution is okay, I recognize that in what I said.
Absolutely. And to just come back to that job analysis point, that's so critical. Bizarrely, it's often the part of the process that's left out. So often. And I think when reviewing recruitment processes, regardless of where that sits in the organisation, whether it's student leadership, professional hiring, so often we kind of point to the gap in, hang on a minute, you haven't actually done any proper job analysis here. Whatever comes after that, it's not going to work if you haven't done your job analysis. So critical, such a critical step. So you saying that was music to my ears. I very much enjoyed that.
I think there is another component to this, and maybe you've got a view on this as well, though, because what could be, and I think we've talked about this in the past, what could be contentious around this is what's going on over in talent and development and the skills-based organisation and new entrants into this space that are going, here's a taxonomy with 20,000 skills. Well, surely you need to anchor in that for your recruitment, but how do you recruit against 20,000 skills? That's not possible. What is a job analysis?
Very true, very true. I think we could dive into skills and never come out, but I'm going to ask you one question on it because I feel we can't not now. Skills within student recruitment. I think, what are the conversations you're having there? Can you assess for skills with that group of people, given that actually you're really hiring for potential? And do you think the conversations that are going on in organisations at the moment, because people are so excited about skills and the pivot to skills, do you think people are kind of getting a bit carried away and maybe missing the mark in student recruitment? I said one question, that was about 5.
Well, I think skills-based hiring per se, right, is probably really effective and impactful in experienced hire, where you've built up kind of a level of skills from your experiences. But then there's the question of, how do you define a skill? Right? And then you're into, well, some people are talking about behaviours when they're really talking about a skill, or they're talking about a trait. And it's like, so you mentioned about the personality piece, and well, that's something you kind of learn rather than through your childhood, rather than you can be taught. So it's almost like, actually it starts with how do you define skills-based hiring, right? And I'd argue in a way, like early careers have probably been the closest to doing skills-based hiring for a long time. It's just not really necessarily skills, or some of them are kind of innate things that actually they are essentially traits that they make up who you are, right? They're not necessarily skills, we're just not labeling them correctly. But the notion of that type of hiring, I think we've been pioneering it, because it rests on the quality of assessment and seeing someone perform something in situ, rather than talking about, this is where I've done it before and here are all my accolades and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I think there's probably a need in student recruitment you almost wanting to think about what's the potential someone has to develop this skill in the workplace. I guess looking back to the work readiness piece.
So the probably where an assessment provider can really support is actually, how do some of those innate capabilities translate into future skills? that's powerful.
Definitely. Agree.
Yeah.
Agree. I think that's probably where the future is going, or should go anyway. I wanted to touch on Gen Z. There's a lot of dialogue at the moment around Gen Z.
They're a nightmare.
Well, I think, focused on work-life balance.
Sure.
Not prepared to give up their life for work, which, do you know what? In a way I get. You know, if you think about starting salaries now in the majority of industries compared to the cost of living increase, I kind of get it. And I think there's a small part of me that kind of respects them. They also have certain expectations of employers and of what employers will provide them with in terms of career development, career progression. But actually, I think a lot of that rhetoric that I've sort of just described there around the typical Gen Z is actually focused more on Western European cultures. And you might not see those same characteristics in the East, for example. Do you think global student recruitment teams are thinking about this enough?
I definitely agree that there's a lot of rhetoric. I definitely agree that it's more pronounced in kind of Western developed countries. You know, I don't operate in every single, but the big ones, the usual suspects, it's definitely a thing. Early careers in general and global early careers team through my map of the world are definitely talking about this. We just launched we in partnership with our learning and development function have just launched a module for managers across the company on helping them understand generational difference, how to work with colleagues at different ages for this very reason. And I think, as with all things, this is also an opportunity. And there's a real opportunity for generations to learn from one another. And I think that's the conversation we should probably be having here, right? There's nothing, it's not Generation Zs, and it's a big label, right? Broad brush, that it's not their fault that their map of the world is different to people who are at the top of the organisation. It's just their map of the world is different, right? Their reference point is totally different. And there's an element of respecting that and trying to understand it, I think. And that's why I think having the conversation and the education element that I mentioned is so important, to actually kind of say, hang on, let's take a step back and think about how can we make the most of this circumstance. But equally, on the flip side, I think there is and it probably comes back to a little bit about organisational work readiness. There's a little bit there about meeting in the middle as well. We mostly hiring early careers talent are big businesses, and businesses function in a certain way. They can't just be, kind of, working from a coffee shop and, there's an element of, yes, of course, some will be more flexible than others, and there might be days where you get to do that. That's fine. But also as well, there's an element where we need you to be present because there's a client meeting or a team meeting, and actually this is important to build relationships. And so I think there's a meeting in the middle, and I think there's a piece for me that the pendulum might have gone a little bit too far one way, and there's an element of organisations being brave enough to have that conversation.
Yes. Do you think they're too fearful that they'll lose talent at the moment?
I think so. And all the indications are that Generation Z want more variety, and they want the opportunity to have side hustles, and so organisations think, well, how can we bend to this kind of, or the opposite end of the spectrum, becoming quite draconian. I mean, we've heard in the news this week, you must be in 5 days a week moving forward, right? It's like, well, okay, what's the solution here? And I think for me, a lot of the solution is the conversation. It's having the dialogue and an open forum where you can have that dialogue, and somewhere meeting in the middle.
And maybe there's an element of, just to go back to our personalisation point, personalisation to that as well, because not everyone's the same, and most people will need slightly different things.
Absolutely, that's fair.
James, final question.
Okay.
What would be your 3 top tips for anyone working in a global recruitment role today?
Don't do it, no. I think probably the first thing is what would I describe this as? Some people talk about cultural intelligence, I guess, but it's
Mm-hmm.
more cultural dexterity, I would say.
Yes.
I think you've got to really be curious about how different cultures operate and think, not just from the market perspective, but the business stakeholder perspective, because what is going to win hearts and minds in one market is not going to win them in another.
Yeah.
And you've got to be tuned into that.
Yeah.
So you've got to ask good questions.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're not going to be able to be in that market and understand it because you're not sitting around someone learning from osmosis and you didn't grow up in that market. So you've got to take time to understand it and learn about it, and then be adaptable enough to say, well, my style in this meeting or this engagement needs to look different to what it is over here, right? So a good example is India, where naturally it is very hierarchical. It is. I've described to you about the tiering at universities. And rather than push against that and say, well, we don't operate like that in the UK, right? It's not going to work. So you've got to then respect that level of hierarchy, but bring to bear the points that you're trying to make in a different way, in a different setting. So that's one area I'd definitely say. Another area, and we touched on this, is about building for customization in a global team is critical, so that you can start to get efficiencies and a one team mentality and a mindset and all the rest of it. But being very, very deliberate as to where there should be nuance, finding that nuance, exploring where that should be, so that you can strike the balance and you can fight for where that consistency should be and where that nuance should come in, because that's really what your expertise should be about. It's ultimately your operation, your team, and stakeholders might not like it. And somebody, in fact, a stakeholder where I work now, once said stakeholders should get what they need, not necessarily what they want. Right? And I think that's really true.
There's a song about that.
Yeah, there might be. I might break out into song in a minute if I'm feeling particularly adventurous. But no, I think it's an important point for a global team. You want people to be happy with the service they're getting. You want them to get great candidates, all of those things. But you cannot please everybody. That's just a fact of life. So you've got to fight for the things that are going to deliver the best overall outcomes. And not everybody will like that. So you've got to be okay with that and very confident in what that looks like. And I'm still learning about that, by the way. I don't think that ever stops. And the final thing that I would say is you've got to practice what you preach when it comes to diversity. If you've got a global team, you've naturally got a diverse team. So how do you get the most out of diversity of thought and unlock the capability of your team? Because there is the power of innovation, of how you can drive your operation and drive better results through your people, through your own team. And so if you're in the market talking about diversity, why it's important, and you're talking about why your organization is hiring diverse talent and how it has all these benefits, if you're not doing that yourself, it's very hard to sell. But if you are, that's an easy sell because you live and breathe it, right? So that's one element of it. But the other aspect is I've seen it generate better results, and it's doing that in my team at the minute. And we're using, for example, we have global priorities and work streams. We've created a PMO within the global team. So we've got a consistency in terms of a way of working across a work stream. But the teams on those work streams, I've got people from Texas talking to somebody in Ipswich, and on that call is somebody in Manila. Can you imagine the perspective in that conversation to solve a problem like, I don't know, keep warm activity? I mean, go figure what's that going to look like. But the output is then, oh wow, I would have never thought of that. So for me, that's been I've talked about it in the past, and I've had great teams. But this has been a real lesson for me in the vehicle of how to unlock diversity and see the benefit.
Love that.
Yeah.
James, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode of The Deep Dive. If you have, please remember to like and subscribe to stay tuned for all our latest content. If you want more information on any of the topics you've heard today, check out the show notes for case studies, resources, and articles. I've been Hannah Mullaney. See you next time on The Deep Dive.